7. They did not have long to wait. Less than an hour later, they spotted the shadows slinking in the woods. The first scout to show itself was indeed that of the inhuman kind. The panther sniffed along the trail. It progressed a dozen yards up the trail of the escarpment when Arnak rose and, in a fluid throw, spitted the beast with a javelin. The animal roared in surprise and pain. The throw had been precise and caught the panther in its lungs. Arnak had speared both of the organs with the throw, but the animal was stubborn and would not instantly expire. It tried to climb the trail and came within a few feet of the hidden women before it slumped to the ground. War whoops issued from misshapen mouths, and the brood of Hotchkinook began slinging stones at the revealed warrior. Arnak ducked as the stones broke against the rock of the escarpment. The Picts reloaded their slings and then released again. This time more of the stones flew through the air as more of the Picts advanced. "Wait!" Arnak commanded the Cimmerians. A third volley of stones flew, and 5 Picts tried to rush the trail. 3 Cimmerian women rose and threw. Of the 3, only 2 struck the Picts soundly. The third scraped a shallow cut along a Pict's arm. Stones bashed against where the women lay in wait. Before the rushing men could make the climb, another Cimmerian woman dropped a heavy boulder on them. She and her sister warrior pushed the boulder over with their shoulders. The falling stone smashed the men beneath it. There was no time for a rally, for after another pelting of stones, the Picts rushed en masse. There were at least 40 men in this charge, and they came behind a hail of stones and javelins. One of the Cimmerian women staggered, as her skull had not been as well hidden as she hoped. The blow caused her to rise and tried to step backward, and before her sister warriors could pull her down, a javelin finished the foe's deadly work. The rushing horde of Picts raised leather and wicker shields to ward off the stream of stones and javelins the Cimmerians hurled. It looked as if they might make the climb. The women grimly prepared themselves with knives and the few steel hatchets that they possessed. But before the climb could be attempted, the Picts faced a foe that clubs and stones could not defeat. The swarm flew out of the trees and descended upon the pelting slingers. Picts leapt out of cover and rushed for the pool of water in which to hide from the stinging swarm. The Picts that were huddled near the bottom of the trail found themselves stalled, as the missile cover they relied upon to make the climb was denied them. Boulders, far heavier than the stones they had been hurling, were lifted from above the heads of the women and crashed down upon the Picts that gathered at the trail. Between the heavy stones the shields could not stop, and the fallen bodies that now fouled the way, the Pictish slingers were hemmed in. Then the swarm of bees fell on the rear of the advancing men. They too were herded towards the pool. Some of the Picts managed to make the open ground and scatter into the woods, but many followed their leaders dumbly into the pool. The muddy ground now sucked at ankles and shins, preventing them from being able to get out of the way. In the small pool, so many men could not hope to hide nor defend themselves. Rocks and stones, barbs and javelins rained down upon them. It took roughly 5 minutes for the Picts to find their end in the pool under the falling weapons. A cheer went up amongst the Cimmerians. A few of them taunted the woods and the still skulking warriors that must be sheltering there. They were answered by voices from the trees, many more than their own. Hotchkinook revealed he had more in his tactical repertoire than sorcery. The Picts appeared again behind their wall of leather shields, but now with spears in hand they drove before them the women that the escapees had left behind. Simpering, shambling, beaten women were marched in front of the points of the spears to shield the advancing Picts from any missiles the Cimmerians might throw. The Cimmerians hesitated, unsure of how best to proceed. The Picts advanced nearly halfway across the ground before one of the sister warriors rose from her cover. She hurled her javelin with desperation in an arc. It sailed over the advancing line of women and just barely penetrated a raised leather shield, but not deep enough to wound. The failed attack prompted the Cimmerians to answer the fray. They began throwing for the Picts and attempting to clear the advancing line of slaves. Unable to vary their attack, the javelins fell almost entirely harmlessly upon the men. Arnak tapped one of every other woman on the shoulder and commanded them to follow him. They snatched up the wooden spears, the ones made for thrusting, that they had fashioned. At the top of the trail that led up the escarpment, there was a small rise of the mountain that shielded those on the trail from view. Quickly the women and Arnak made a pair of battle lines. Then they waited. The slave women were forced to march up the trail, and now they blocked the Picts behind them completely from the women above. The women tried to hurl weapons at the Picts from a new angle, but there was not enough room on the outcrop to maneuver. Arnak and his warriors waited, watching the slave women pass them by. When the second, rather than the first row of the Picts appeared in their vision, they sprang their ambush. With a great shout of "Crom!" the Cimmerians thrust. The Picts, their shields turned to deflect the missiles to their right and above, fell in a swath before the thrusting spear points. 10 Picts died instantly, and many more were wounded. The Picts behind the advancing front ranks, however, were not taken by surprise, and some shifted to attack the spear wielders before them. A few died trying to advance on the Cimmerians, but more managed to slip past the probing points and press their advantage in close combat. The men were armed with clubs and stone hatchets, but these were all they needed. The Cimmerian women still sold their lives dearly. As one woman died, she took at least one Pict with her into the afterlife. Then the Picts ceased their advance. From behind them the swarm of bees had finished gathering. The stings and attacks of the bees clustered around the men's heads. These Picts were determined and tried to shrug off the attack. But the distraction proved more advantageous to the defenders than the effect. Every Pict that gave a moment to swat at the insects was one that could not defend himself. The Cimmerian women kept the majority at bay by the use of their spears. Some of the women picked up the dropped hatchets of the fallen and applied them to the use of chopping up Picts rather than wood. The attack was beaten backward, and the Picts began to retreat, their shields in front of them. They had only the scantest idea of a shield wall. Between the gaps that no Aquilonian or Vanir would have ever allowed in a shield wall, the Cimmerians found homes for their remaining javelins. 5 more of the Picts were dispatched before the retreat was complete. The Cimmerians roared out, "Crom! Crom! Crom, count the dead!" again at the Picts. There was no responding battle cry. The Cimmerians, with the practicality of their race, began gathering what weapons and shields their foes had left behind, and arming themselves and the women that had been driven to them. Arnak found he now believed they would indeed win the day. Then from the woods the panthers appeared. When Hachkanuk had sent the panthers after Arnak, there had been only a half-dozen of them. Now 40 or more of the beasts showed themselves. Hachkanuk's voice spoke through their open mouths. "I will enslave you all. I will cut off your feet and hands. I will give you suffering the likes of which shall be legendary throughout all the lands of the Picts and the backward places from which you hail. You look upon your doom." In the time it had taken for Hachkanuk to issue his threat, Lear had appeared from where he had been hiding and working his will upon the insects. He stood now by Arnak. "Make a line, here, and shield me from view," Lear commanded. "We can't hold them," Arnak said as he hefted a javelin. "We won't have to. Just hide me, and when I speak, have everyone step behind me," Lear said. "But the cats," Branwen quailed. "Find your courage, woman," Lear snarled at her. Then he knelt and began carefully drawing in the soil. His voice intoned a deep chant. The women about him became uncomfortable from the threat and the display of sorcery. Had it not been for Arnak, they would have faltered. But a look from the Pict, and they remained. The cats rushed. Hurled javelins and stones managed to take 2 of them down. The spear line managed to dissuade 2 of the others with its hedge of points, yet it would not hold. The cats leapt for the people clustered together on the trail. "Now!" Lear shouted. The Cimmerian women took 3 steps backward at a trot, and revealed on the trail was Lear, still kneeling, and the arcane sign he had inscribed in the ground. The cats, even the ones in the air, ceased their growling. They crowded around Lear, snarling and twitching. "Jebel Sag," Lear intoned through his throat. The cats paced around him, their behavior unsure. "Jebel Sag," Lear repeated. From the woods, a shout of the same name went up from the shadows, but unlike Lear's voice, it no longer sounded confident of itself. The panthers lay down before the sign. To assault the fleeing Cimmerians, the shaman had to be sure he used animals that remembered Jebel Sag. Their loyalty was not to Hachkanuk, but to the lord of their kind. They touched their heads to the ground with reverence and bowed before the symbol that united the natural forces of the world. The panthers rose and sauntered away from the world of men and their wars. They disappeared back into the forest and to the violence of the hunt, which is far more honest and noble. Lear stood exposed so that the Picts hiding in the shadows could see him. He raised his arms, and the remaining elements of the swarm of bees he had asked for aid, roosted there. From the tree line, the doubt of the Picts was palatable. Here a foreigner had proven more powerful than their shaman. Here, a foreigner with the strange eyes of their totem peered back at them, judging them. The Picts had spoken of Lear in whispers ever since his capture and the day his eyes changed color. His servitude and Hotchkinuck's obvious power had allayed those primitive fears for a time. Yet now Lear was not a slave, and the animals responded to him. From the shadows of the woods, Lear and the others heard Hotchkinuck order an attack, yet none of the Picts moved. Lear did not remain stationary. He began pacing towards the Picts. His every step increased his dreadful presence amongst them. Lear walked the entire way towards the Pictish line across the open ground, fearless and sure of his right to command them. He spoke to them in their tongue. "Leave this place. Never come east again. Bring me Hotchkinuck, and we will settle this dispute between us in the old way." Lear dared them. "You are not a Pict," one of the simpletons said. Lear directed his hands towards the man, and the swarm began to fly towards him. He slunk back into the woods and peeked at Lear from behind a tree. Lear turned his attention back to the rest of the Picts. "Leave this place. Never come east again. Bring me Hotchkinuck, and we will settle this in the old way," he commanded. The addled Crow Picts reared backward, and several whimpered in fear at the display of the angry magician that now berated them. Hotchkinuck was prodded forward by the Picts, who pushed and shoved him to the front. He was trembling with sweat, having exerted much of his vigor in the control of so many minds and animals. He tried to regain his dignity in the last few steps, walking towards Lear alone. The shaman stood tall, and with arrogance he dismissed Lear. "You cannot issue a challenge to me. Only a chieftain can oversee such a contest," Hotchkinuck declared. "But I will allow you the honor of returning to your kind and prepare your defense." Lear was unmoved by the shaman's bravado. His eyes fell upon Kanajahari. "Tell me, Kanajahari, where is the chieftain of the Crow?" Lear asked. He passed away," Kanajahari answered, "along with his son." Lear asked, "And the Crow have been led by this sorcerer ever since?" "Know you, Kanajahari, of any tribe of the Picts that allows a sorcerer to be their chieftain? Are the spirits not revolted? Have they not turned from the Crow? Nearly 60 of your tribe lays dead here, and 20 more in your camp. Tell me, how long will it take the Crow to recover the loss of so many warriors?" The Picts did not miss the implications of the word sorcerer that Lear had used. In their language, a sorcerer meant a man that was perverse and tried to constrain the spirits rather than interpret their will as a shaman should. Such a perversion was a thing of Stygia and the evil lands of civilized men. "A great deal of time," Kanajahari admitted after a pause. "The entire while the Crow will be pecked at by other tribes, like vultures and crows do at a carcass. How will you gain warriors to replace your losses and protect your land now that you have chased away all your women? The Cimmerian women there, they will each kill another Crow and fall to their deaths before they birth you any sons. All because the Crow followed the commands of the sorcerer rather than a chieftain? Is it not time, perhaps, for the Crow to take a chieftain?" "The spirits have not revealed a new chieftain," Hotchkinuck shouted. "Or perhaps you have merely neglected to tell the Crow whom the spirits wish to lead them. If you can hear the ancestors at all, sorcerer," Lear effectively hissed. "Liar! He lies!" Hotchkinuck proclaimed. "What spirit ever spoke to a Cimmerian? They don't even pray to their own god." "That is true. Cimmerians do not normally pray to Crom," Lear purred. "But I am only half Cimmerian. My father was an Asir, and the Picts do not doubt that the spirits speak to the dreaded men of the snowy north." The Picts murmured amongst themselves. They had often fought the Vanir and their cousin Asir. The religion of these people was not entirely dissimilar to their own, having an element of ancestor worship and the veneration of place spirits. The Asir and Vanir called on gods in battle, but to the Picts, a god was merely a more potent spirit than the ancestors, or an ancestor of great might. The Vanir had made many costly incursions into the Pictish wilderness, and the Asir had taken away many as slaves. Perhaps the spirits do speak to him. Perhaps it is not sorcery, the murmur went amongst them. Kanajahari, would not the spirits be pleased by you leading the noble crow, until such time as their will can truly be known? Is there no more deserving and noble warrior amongst this band now but thee? Lyra said. Hotchkinook saw the stratagem well now. Lyra had chosen a warrior that had been wronged by Hotchkinook, and one that was cunning and skilled in arms. The other warriors of the tribe had indeed perished in his assault. He snarled at Lyra and tried to grab the Cimmerian, but strong, misshapen hands held him fast. I, Kanajahari, take this tribe under my wisdom, the man screamed. The Pict shouted in loyalty. Kanajahari revolved in place so he could see the face of every man and be sure of his command. And I decree that we shall give the foreign shaman the right to duel this sorcerer in the old way. The Picts raised their fists and shouted joy. None of them had any idea who to favor, but they were sure that now they would be given a display of legendary dueling that would make them the envy of every Pict that was not there to witness it. They surrounded the men in a ring. Hotchkinook looked at his former tribe. His eyes promised painful death for this betrayal. Then he turned them on Lyra. He spat at the Cimmerian. Kanajahari smiled as he approached Lyra. He was unafraid of the swarming insects. He knew that the Cimmerian would keep his word, for it was well known that Cimmerians believed that a man's word was the only thing that was inviolate. He leaned close to the Cimmerian blacksmith and said, "Well, you have your duel now, Hillman. Do us all a favor and murder the son of a bitch." The old way of the Picts was an official challenge to a duel with spears. Every Pict was expected to be able to kill with a spear. Those who had the most skill and had proven themselves in great contests or battles were granted the title one who slays with the spear. Spear slayers were the epitome of Pictish manhood, and the civilized lands had learned to fear them with great dread. Into each of the hands of the two men a spear with a wicked flint tip was placed. They were stripped of their clothing, and the contest was to the death. No magic or charms would be permitted. To resort to such measures was to admit that one was not a warrior, and in this case, that one was not a Pict. The Picts did allow the combatants to paint themselves with woad. An intricate language had evolved amongst the Picts. The worlds of a Pict hold family ties, battles, deeds, and all the honors of which the primitive tribe valued. Hotchkinook was painted by a man, the name of which Lyra did not know. Lyra wore only the symbol of Jebel Sag upon his chest, so that any monster the shaman may call up might not harm him. Hotchkinook scowled. It had clearly been his intention to do this very thing. Now he would have to face Lyra as a man. Yet other tricks might still be in his possession, and Lyra was not one to take his opponent lightly. The shaman had proven he was ruthless and inventive. Bets were being traded amongst the onlookers, and they clearly favored Hotchkinook. Lyra spared a moment's regret for what he had done to Kalukar. Then he shook his head. The Pict had made his choice when he had mistaken what Hotchkinook had encouraged for manly ethics. Hotchkinook stood with his feet close together, the better to slip and shuffle. His spear was held low and against his belly, the point near the ground. Having recovered some of his energy, he sneered at Lyra. He clearly thought himself man enough to defeat the blacksmith by virtue of being a Pict. Lyra did not respond. He felt a hand upon his shoulder. He knew that there would be no physical person there. He glanced and saw the raven-haired phantasm that haunted him. She was dressed in nothing but a cloak of gray storm clouds, and upon her skin woad patterns similar to the Pictish kind were painted. She carried a spear. The phantom goddess placed her spear tip on the ground and then flicked the spear upward, casting dirt into the air. Lyra nodded. She was warning him as to why the shaman was holding his spear low. Then the apparition thrust her own spear into the air and twisted it. Lyra understood this advice as well. He interpreted it as, "When you thrust, twist, so that even if this man kills you, the wound will never close and he will bleed to death. Do not go to your ancestors alone or unblooded." "It would help more if you troublesome goddesses would just talk like normal people," Lyra hissed. "But thank you." The apparition dissipated, and Lyra's vision now centered solely on the shaman. He placed his own spear in the middle ward, with the butt of the spear low and the point pointed towards Hotchkinook's face. It was a typical position taken by those who were not very familiar with the weapon. It seemed like a good warding position, but in truth it limited the wielder. Hotchkinook was fooled by the deception. He assumed that Lear would strike for his face to fluster the shaman. Hotchkinuck tried to scoop the soil onto his spearhead and flick it into the blacksmith's eyes. This he followed with a thrust of the spear, trying to extend the weapon as far forward as he could. But what he found was nothing. The dirt sailed over Lear's head as the blacksmith ducked, and the spear thrust of the shaman was patted aside by the rising shaft of Lear's spear. The shaman, trying to extend his thrust as far as he could, was holding his spear by its end in both of his hands, whereas the Cimmerian, with a quick rise of his rear hand and a flip of his lead hand, brought his spear under the shaman's strike. The tip of Lear's spear whisked forward, but the shaman maneuvered to be just an inch out of reach. The two combatants parted a step. Hotchkinuck's face betrayed his frustration and anger. Lear's own impassive expression angered the Pict all the more. Hotchkinuck tried coming forward behind a double jab of his spear, but Lear did not fall for the ploy. The Cimmerian easily beat aside both of the lightly committed thrusts with the smallest move of his own spearhead. Hotchkinuck next tried to rapidly beat aside Lear's defenses with slices of the spear tip, but to no avail. It was almost a repeat exchange of when Lear and Arnak had sparred with staves. But Hotchkinuck was not as wiry as Arnak, nor as strong as Lear. The Cimmerian's deflections barely used any of his energy, and his attacks were strong. Hotchkinuck found himself straining against them. In desperation, the shaman tried to close with Lear, but the Cimmerian merely sidestepped, and with a flick of his spear point, the Cimmerian retook the center line. Hotchkinuck was forced to reset himself. He means to wear me down. He means to humiliate me before he slays me, Hotchkinuck thought to himself. Well, I've not run out of tricks yet, boy, though I had hoped not to resort to this. Hotchkinuck waited now for Lear to attack. He slipped the first few jabbing thrusts that Lear gave him by shifting his body. Then when he thought he had Lear overcommitted to a thrust, Hotchkinuck sprung his tactic. It was a difficult trick to perform, but the reward for it was high. Hotchkinuck baited Lear to strike for his midsection. When the Cimmerian complied, Hotchkinuck slipped sideways and let go of his own spear so he might wrap his arms around the Cimmerian's weapon. The danger of the spear was largely in the spearhead's bite. If a warrior could get past the point, he turned his opponent's weapon into a stick rather than a sharply edged spear. Hotchkinuck wrapped up the spear in his arms, and then he slammed his shoulder into Lear's gut. Or rather, the shaman tried, for when Lear found his weapon bound, he released it, rather than fight for it. His hands flew out in rough hook punches as he sidestepped. One of the punches missed, but the other caught Hotchkinuck in the kidney. The shaman screamed as he limped away from the Cimmerian. The kidney was already a sensitive spot in which to be struck, but the Cimmerian's blacksmith's strength made it doubly so. The Picts that surrounded them roared their approval. Hotchkinuck barely managed to adjust his grip on the spear he now held. He jabbed with the butt for Lear's head and caused the blacksmith to backpedal. When the blacksmith tried to kneel to retrieve the spear that Hotchkinuck had dropped, he found the shaman slicing and jabbing at him. Hotchkinuck roared as he attacked in a flurry of motion. He knew that he had the Cimmerian now. All that was needed was one lucky thrust. But in trying to force that moment, the shaman telegraphed the intent of one of these attacks, and the Cimmerian brought his arms up under the spear's shaft. Deflecting the spear up and away, Lear gripped the shaft with his left hand, and with his right he smashed the bottom of his fist against the lead arm of the shaman. By luck or providence, Lear's fist smashed on top, where Hotchkinuck's arm muscle and nerve met over his radial bone. The pain was severe, and the shaman let go of the weapon with his lead hand. Lear reared back with his right hand, and Hotchkinuck thought that the blacksmith would strike him with the fist. But instead, Lear brought his arm down on the shaft of the spear. The shaft gave way and splintered. The Cimmerian rushed forward. Lear's right hand reached out, and he grappled with the shaman, who was beating the sides of the blacksmith with the ruined remains of his spear shaft. Yet the blunt instrument did little more than bruise Lear. Lifting the spearhead like a man would use an ice pick, Lear sank the flint blade into the artery that lay beneath the shaman's clavicle. Hotchkinuck whimpered in shock as Lear withdrew the point, and blood rushed into the air. Yet the Cimmerian was not done with the shaman. The years of torture and service had given Lear a great many wrongs that he wished Hotchkinuck suffer for. The Cimmerian tripped the older man to the ground and fell upon him with the spear point in both hands. He punctured the shaman's chest over and over again until the blood coated the blacksmith's forearms. The Picts were silent, for they were moved to a fearful awe. Lear continued to beat upon the body of the shaman long after it was still. Perhaps he did not know that his hated persecutor was dead. In the heat of his bloody rage, the Cimmerian's arms moved with their own, almost mechanical and tireless accord. When Lear finally ceased to strike the dead meat underneath him, it was because Kanajahari called out, "He is dead!" Lear looked up at the Picts that surrounded him. Then he looked back down to the ruined meat that was the corpse beneath him. He stood slowly and expected the Picts to rush him, but instead they sheltered in the shadows. Kanajahari approached the Cimmerian and held out his hand for the spearhead. Lear, now feeling the exhaustion of the fight, the combat, and the duel, did so without resistance. "Raise your arms," Kanajahari commanded. Lear did so. Then the newly declared Pictish chief took the broken spear, and with its flint tip he cut lines along Lear's body, over the man's ribs. Into these wounds the Picts pressed some ashy substance to staunch the bleeding. "I, Kanajahari, chieftain of the Crow, grant you, Lear Yellow Eyes, with the honor of being one who slays with the spear. Your deed will be carried all throughout the woods. Not a Pict that stalks under the tree shall not know you. Go, take your women home, and trouble us no more," the chieftain said. And he pressed the spear point into Lear's hand and shoved him away from the Picts. "You will not follow?" Lear asked. "No. You are a shaman who has slain another shaman. I do not wish to be near you if the spirits exact their revenge," Kanajahari replied. Lear nodded dumbly. He turned and staggered towards the escarpment where the escapees and Arnak waited. As he walked, he thought he felt his familiar phantasmal companions take his arms and aid him in moving his legs. He was beyond knowing for sure or caring to make the distinction between the dreaming world and the waking one. When he reached the pool, two of the Cimmerian women caught him and prevented him from falling. "He's dead. I killed him," Lear tried to say, but he was unsure if the words left his lips. The world breathed beneath him in its slumber. Lear breathed out, and the world breathed in. The world breathed out, and he breathed in. The phantasmal women stood around his body in a triangle. They faced outward, and each bore a spear. He sensed that they were keeping sentry against something. The glowing world of the dreaming landscape seemed relieved. Animals grunted, and birds sang without fear. He could not move. He was so overwhelmed with the power, with the ebb and flow of the immense quantity of all the life around him. A weird cry sounded in the forest, as if a stag and a wolf could call in unison. Lear glanced to the side and saw a shadow moving between the trees. It walked on 4 legs. The back legs were those of a deer, the forelegs those of a hunting cat. It was covered in the fur of a bear, yet had stag-like head. A lone reptilian tail swayed behind it, and a pair of crow-like wings decorated its back. The eyes of the shadow glowed with a bright white light, and Lear could see that the pupils were those of an ancient serpent. It was a shadow cast by Jebel Sag. The animal god did not give Lear any sense of approval or disapproval. Such concepts belonged to men and their world of narrow vision. This world was the world of animals and spirits. The animal god instead recognized the Cimmerian. Without the limit of words, it left for Lear an impression. Dream, strong, and true. Then it shuffled back into the forest of the night. Jebel Sag called to something man could never have knowledge of that lay hidden behind the stars. To Lear the great voice sounded full of longing. He passed into a deeper slumber. Beneath him he could feel the slow but constant turning of the year, the reaching roots of the trees, and the deep fires of the earth. Above him the planets traveled in their paths, and the stars winked at him, as if they were hinting at some great secret. He awoke in great pain. Every part of his limbs were stiff. Someone had washed him in his sleep, and the sign of the foreign god was missing from his chest. His ribs ached where the scarification the Picts had been wrought. What new trial awaited him today he knew not. He was unaccompanied, both of human and phantasmal company. He rose painfully and found that the spearhead he had brought back with him was laying by his side. Lear knelt and retrieved it. Then he made his way back to where he and Shiel had been parted. Her tree looked more hale than when he had left it. Signs of its age and rot were now tempered by thin green shoots along its branches. Lear placed the spearhead by the foot of the trunk. "You have earned this as much as I have," he whispered to Shyle. Then he left her, afraid that if he did not make himself rejoin the world of men that waited for him, he might remain in the woods forever. There was much to be done still, and he could not afford the luxury of indulging his desires. Lear found that the majority of the Cimmerian women were safe. A pyre had been erected, and upon it the survivors had lain their dead. The smoke ascended upward, and Lear noted that the plume leaned towards Ben Morg, the mountain of Crom. But he knew that one should not read too much into omens. It was too tempting to see only what one wished. He heard someone approaching him. Lear looked and saw that Arnak and Oak were walking towards him. His keen eyes also noticed the unapproving glances of the rest of the retinue as the couple passed. Hatred appears stronger than love in the dead of arms, at least for most, Lear thought. "You live," Arnak said. "I was afraid they had poisoned you when they marked you." "No. Kana Jahari is now chieftain of the Crow. He has many faults, but ingratitude is not one of them," Lear replied. Then he smiled sadly and asked, "Do we remain for a day longer, or do we take the trail?" "That is what Oak and I have been debating. She insists that we remain for 3 to 4 days to provision. I would be away from this place," Arnak said. "Do Pictish men often take the counsel of women?" Lear teased. "No, but we are smart enough to listen to warriors," Arnak returned. "Particularly those that share our beds, eh?" Lear asked. Arnak was earnestly flustered. Oak hid her laugh behind her palm. Then she spoke. "You were spoken for, Derwood. I wasn't about to come between you and your lover, so I settled for an equal, even if he is of a different tribe." At first, Arnak did not understand that the two Cimmerians were having a jest about him. It was not until he saw the mirth in Oak's eyes that he understood. Then he played along as well. "So since my woman and I are divided upon the issue, we come to you, Shaman, to be the deciding voice. Shall we stay, or shall we forage as we go?" Arnak asked. Lear examined the faces and the body language of the other Cimmerian women. From the stances and somewhat turned heads, he could tell that the women, though they had fought beside Arnak, would never accept him. They might slay the Pict in his sleep. Nor could Lear guarantee that as they neared Cimmeria, that one of his countrymen might not attempt to plant a feathered arrow in Arnak's gut. Lear glanced back at Oak. She was clearly invested in the hunter and would not leave him. Should any harm come to him, she would exact her own vengeance upon those that spilled his blood. "I think you and your wife should make haste back to your own land, Arnak of the Osprey. And as you travel, please be sure to tell all of the death of Hotchkanook and the deeds of Lear of the Yellow Eyes." "I will lead the women back to their homeland," Lear said. Arnak blinked. He asked, "What wife?" Lear held out his hand to Grania. She handed him a leather cord from her belt. Then Lear held out his hand to Arnak. The hunter extended his hand. Then Lear tied Arnak and Oak's hands together. Lear said aloud the words that Cimmerians intoned whenever two were married. "If the gods ever smile, it's when two people wed," Lear cried out. A few of the Cimmerian women nearby gave the appropriate response, though it lacked any enthusiasm or warmth. They cried out, "Crom count the children." Arnak, though he had many women he had cared for in his life, sensed that this bond was somehow more serious and likely to be more trying than he had at first imagined. The Picts did not marry. A woman simply gave birth to a man's children, and he helped care for them. A sense of dread, as keen as that of facing down an angry bear, bloomed in his spirit. He looked at Oak and realized he was fastly and securely trapped. He wisely decided not to mention this out loud. "Are you sure you will be able to find the way?" Arnak asked. "I can already see the path," Lear said, and he pointed to his temple. "And I have those within reach that can help me find the way." With this he pointed skyward to the birds that flew above their camp. "Well, if you are certain," Arnak prompted. Lear was suddenly reluctant to let the Pict leave. The man, though a member of Lear's ancestral enemies, was one of the few men who had ever acknowledged his worth. Truly, Crom laughs at us, Lear thought. He extended his arm, and the Pict grabbed him by the elbow as a sign of friendship. "I do not know why Jeel, god of the crows, has favored you so, but I am glad in his wisdom that he saw fit to do so. Should you ever find yourself upon the western coast, amongst the Osprey you will have a place," Arnak promised. Then the men parted, Arnick and Oak walked away. The couple gathered their few things, then proceeded to leave the survivors behind. The women watched them depart with an impassive air. Then Lear drew the women's attention to him. He waited until he was sure all eyes were on him. "We will remain here one more night to gather water, prepare tools, and get a good night's rest. Then we shall depart for our homeland. It is not far, merely 2 weeks or so journey. Once we are again amongst the people of the Duns, we can make arrangements for each of you to be returned to your people, or to become part of a settlement," Lear said to them. He waited to see if any would naysay him. When none did, he continued, "I know the suffering you have endured has caused you to fear that our kinsmen have forgotten you, or may not accept you back. I assure you that any kinsman that claims so will face my Geisa. My word will travel far from dun to dun, and there will be none that do not know their faults. Now, let us begin our preparations. We leave tomorrow just after daybreak." The women nodded their assent to Lear's command. Lear busied himself with gathering medicinal herbs, while others set snares and gathered wild vegetables. Lear was too busy to notice that while he and the women worked, that one of their number was still frightened of him and his power. Branwen flitted from woman to woman. Her whispered questions went unheard by Lear. He was unaware that a persuasive poison was being poured against him. That night he slept against the now living trunk of the oak tree in which Shyle slumbered. He lay with his back against the trunk and a scrap of cloth for a blanket. He did not dream in the visionary way this evening, but when he awoke he sensed the presence of the 3 spirit women that haunted him. In the night he had dreamed they were chanting or singing, though now he could not repeat the tune. Only the feeling that he was accepted, that he was finally in the company of those to which he belonged. It was forgivable that the young man mistook this company of refugees he had escaped with as being more accepting of him than those who had abused him in his youth. He painted his eyes with part of the symbol of Jebel Sag, the lines of which spoke of things that fly and search. Nothing answered his call at first. Shah had warned him that without a place of power from which to draw, the power would take longer to manifest. Lear concentrated, and in his mind he envisioned the flitting step and flight of the crows. It was not long until he felt a response. Eyes still closed, he stretched out forth his hand. He felt a phantasmal touch upon his skin. The spirit woman with the raven hair was holding his outstretched palm. She sang 3 strange notes. Into Lear's open palm a crow landed. It cawed loudly twice. Lear opened his eyes and met the gaze of the crow. He sang part of his songline to it, the part that ended in Dunscathach. The home he had been raised in, where Chieftain Rion and his wife Deirdre must surely hold court. The crow cawed again, and then took flight, landing some 100 feet away, and cawing again, calling for the Cimmerians to follow. Lear's trance abided, and he began walking after the animal. He motioned for the women to follow, and wordlessly they did so. Had Lear been more skilled with his new art, it would not have required such concentration or demanded such mental energy of him, and he would have noticed the stares of disgust upon the women's faces. For 5 days they walked, the crow calling their way. It led them to clean water and fresh food. Game was easy to catch, and the trail, though difficult, was not hazardous. Large predators could be heard snuffling at the edges of their camp in the dark, yet never came too close. The signs of Jebel Sag that Lear drew in the soil about their camps proved a protective ward. On the 5th day they passed by a site where Lear had nearly been sacrificed by Hotchkanook. The Cimmerians averted their eyes, and many whispered Crom's name. A sense of loss moved through Lear, for this site had once been that of their ancient kinsman's work. He wondered how much else the Cimmerians had lost to time. He doubted now if even the best lore had been kept. The evening of the 6th night they came to another low hill. This one was bald, with no trees or stones atop its crown. All around it a hedge of thick thorns and briars waited. The crow flew past this barrier and called for them to follow. With their hatchets they cleared away the brambles and created an opening. They gasped at what they beheld. Inside the hedge, stonework with Cimmerian patterns stood waiting for them. They had discovered an ancient barrow, the resting place of the old Cimmerian kings. They were now in the borderland of woods that was neither Pictish nor Cimmerian. Walking in front of the women, Lear tapped the ground with his walking stick. The ground sounded strange. He walked along it, and as he was moving along its gentle rise, he determined the hill was in fact an overgrown hollow dome of human croft, rather than a naturally occurring land feature. Near the top of the hill, the ground fell away, and below them stretched a darkness that did not reveal its secrets of what lay below. Lear found himself peering over the edge, wondering idly what forgotten history lay below them. Then he felt something heavy smash across the back of his head. He spun, his world reeling, to see a clump of the Cimmerian women battering him with clubs and staves. At their lead was Branwen, her face contorted in religious fervor and superstitious fear. "Die, sorcerer!" she screamed as she thrust at him with her staff. He tried to grab it to right himself, but the multiple blows forced him back. In the forest, he had heard the crows cawing, laughing. Were the spirits of the Crow tribe come to enact revenge for him breaking his defiance of Hotchkanook? Did these spirits consider the duel to have been illegitimate? He might never know, for Lear was tumbling downward and was unsure how long it took for the unyielding stones beneath him to meet his head.